This is Lab 4, Oscillations for Physics 2211. Here's what we'll be covering in this presentation and video. The purpose of this lab is to observe and determine the effects of gravity and spring force on an object's oscillating motion and how this relates to the energy principle. This is done by observing and analyzing the oscillating motion of a mass attached to a spring, creating a computational model based on the analysis that predicts the position of the object, and then comparing the experimental and predicted position data using physics principles. These principles include Newton's second law or the momentum principle. This focuses on the fact that net force acting upon an object is dependent on the object's acceleration and mass. Derived from Newton's second law are two important formulas, the velocity update formula and the position update formula. The forces that will be taken into consideration are the gravitational force and spring force, and when we add them together, we'll get the net force. We'll also need to know the formulas for kinetic energy, gravitational potential energy, and spring potential energy. These will be used following the energy principle as shown. For this experiment, I chose the system to be the mass, spring, and the Earth. As a result, there will be nothing in the surroundings. We are given a mass of 0.402 kilograms, and at the end of this experiment, we'll see that the computational model predicts the experimental data fairly well, although there are some differences between the x position and y position versus time graphs. We'll also see that the total change in energy is 0, which reflects the changes in energies involved in the system. Here you can see the video clip of the spring and mass where the origin is located at the top of the spring. From the video, I was able to determine the initial position as shown. The initial velocity is 0 because it started from rest. In order to determine the period of oscillation, I averaged the time between 4 completed oscillations, and the final observed time is also something I will use later for the GlowScript code. Before inputting the collected data from Tracker into GlowScript, I first needed to determine two additional variables, spring constant and the relaxed length of the spring. These are needed to calculate spring force. Knowing the equation for oscillation period, I was able to rearrange and solve for the spring constant, which can then be used to solve for relaxed length, knowing that static equilibrium of the system occurs if spring force is equal to gravitational force. Here on the left, you can see that I used the initial position, velocity, and given mass from before to set the initial conditions for the code. On the right are the variables needed to calculate spring force as well as the various types of energies that will be involved in this system. Here I used the equations discussed earlier. Here is the calculation while loop, which runs for as long as t is less than about 9.5 seconds, which was the final observed time from before. First, I set the initial energies, then used the force formulas from before, and used the momentum principle, which includes the velocity and position update formula. Since spring motion isn't constant, we also need to update the spring's position separately. Finally, we can calculate the change in energy by finding the difference between final and initial energies. This comes out to be 0, which will be discussed later. So here's the model produced and the corresponding graphs. On the left, we have the change in energy versus time graph, which displays the change in kinetic energy, the change in gravitational potential energy, the change in spring potential energy, and the change in total energy. On the right, we have the position versus time graphs for both the x and y positions. We can observe that the change in gravitational and spring potential energies are opposite signs and are oscillating. The change in kinetic energy also oscillates, and its magnitude is less than those of the potential energies. We can also see that the model better predicts the x position of the experiment as it slightly over-predicts the y position. These errors may be due to excluding the presence of other forces such as air resistance, not accounting for other energies in the system, as well as human error when tracking the center of mass. To further this discussion, we can ask if the energy principle is satisfied. The answer is yes, because the graph shows that the change in kinetic, gravitational potential, and spring potential energy all add up to 0, maintaining 0 change in total energy. This implies that there is nothing in the surroundings doing work on the system, which is true because the system for this experiment includes the mass, spring, and the Earth. When we compare oscillation periods, we get slightly differing results. The x position graph seems to have an oscillation period of 1.662 seconds, while the y position graph seems to have an oscillation period of approximately 1.52 seconds. This difference is about 0.142 seconds and is likely due to the errors mentioned earlier. This is important to recognize because the oscillation period affects the spring constant, which ultimately affects spring force, net force, and spring potential energy. So that's it for the lab. Thank you for watching.